The U.S. Department of Energy is cleaning up the Oak Ridge Reservation of residual hazardous and radioactive contamination left over as a result of decades of nuclear energy research. Much of that work has been influenced by the Oak Ridge Site-Specific Advisory Board, a citizens panel that provides independent advice and recommendations on DOE's cleanup operations. You're welcome to attend the meetings and be part of this important work. For more information, call us or visit our website.
Okay, everybody, let's kick off. This is the June 2013 meeting of the Oak Ridge Site-Specific Advisory Board. Welcome to everyone. Glad y'all could come in on this hot day. Before we get into the good business, we'll get a few little things out of the way. First of all, there will be no July meeting. DOE decided not to make a presentation for July. Now, in August is our month for our annual planning meeting, and we usually do that in lieu of having a meeting, so I guess our next regular meeting in here will be in September. David, do we know yet what we might be talking about in September? I know it's a ways off.
I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
That's
there
fair.
probably is a plan, I just don't have it.
No,
That's fair.
Yeah.
I understand.
Right.
All right.
You are
Okay.
doing new member orientation, though, right?
Yes.
Yes.
I was going to mention that in my comments.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, I was just asking for clarification that Dave is going to be doing the new member orientation in July in lieu of a meeting.
Okay.
But
All right,
but
okay.
he'll talk more about that.
All right. That's great. Good. Okay, Sue, I think we're gonna turn this over to you we've got some service award presentations tonight, huh?
We do. We absolutely do. Would you like me to do that first before making comments?
Well, whatever one you want to do.
Okay.
Do your comments or that. We've got you down for doing these first, but whatever you
Okay.
want to do.
All right, let me just sit here for one quick second. I thought I would share a few opening remarks and then honor some people that have dedicated some time to the board. First, you mentioned the heat, Dave, and it is certainly upon us, and that's something that we are trying to remain very cognizant of and visual for our work at the site. So now that the summer months are upon us, it really has an impact on the workers, and we work very hard to try to make sure that we don't have any unnecessary heat exposures. So I just thought I would mention that. We've been spending a fair amount of time on the formulation of our fiscal year 15 budget. I know that you all were very helpful several months ago in helping us to put together our priorities and whatnot. What has happened since is that our headquarters has given us a target number, which is embargoed, so we're not allowed to share it with you at this time, but we have been busy putting together our budget and developing a integrated priorities list of all of the various projects and what their priority would be based on the numbers that we've been given. We will share that list with EPA and with the state as a part of our collaboration process, and we'll continue our discussions with them and use that information on making sure that we have regulatory milestones in place and other things to ensure that work is progressing. So that's taken up a fair amount of our time. In project space, we are continuing to make significant progress on the preparation of the remaining units of the K-25 building. Those units are expected to be demolition ready later this summer, and we do plan to begin demolition of those last remaining units. There's 6 in all, sometime in the early fall, so that's very exciting. We're also continuing to make progress on preparing the K-27 building for demolition, and also we're making progress on our disposition of our U-233 material from the Oak Ridge National Lab, and also the processing of our transuranic waste. So that's the focus right now, and all is going well in those areas. So with that, I think I'm going to move up here and ask a few. Oh, Greg, did you have a question?
I do.
Good.
You started with a brief statement about the FY15 budget and said,
Yes.
oh, but we're going to go do that, blah, blah, blah.
Oh,
When are you going to share it with us? When do you anticipate it being finalized?
right. So the budget will be released by the president. As far, we had the public workshop, and we talked about priorities, and we gathered input, not only from the community and other stakeholders, but also from EPA and TDEC. And it's at this point in the process where things become held pretty tightly or pretty close by the department. And so we will be working for the next several months on making our case and trying to convince all of the decision makers that of what type of funding we should receive. And then the president will release the budget, which is when it becomes publicly available, and that typically is done in the November timeframe. Now, you may recall that for the fiscal year 14, the president's budget was not released until February, so we were, a little late at that point. So there's no guarantee, but typically it does occur around Thanksgiving.
And you are currently on an interim that takes you to September 30th.
We're currently in fiscal year 13, which ends September 30th, and we never received an appropriation bill for this year. The first half of the year, we were on a continuing resolution, which basically meant that our funding was based on our fiscal year 12 appropriation bill, and the second half of the year, we've been under sequestration, which is the same for all agencies within the federal government. So we're hoping that Congress will pass a bill early in fiscal year 14. There is the possibility that there may be a continuing resolution again for some period of time, but we're hopeful that there will be a bill passed so that we will actually have a budget to work from.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Okay. Anything else?
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to move up to the front. So we have several people to honor tonight. It's kind of bittersweet, I think, in terms of the fact that we're saying goodbye to these members who are leaving the board. Will the following individuals please join me? Chuck Jensen, David Martin, and Tom Volunas. And the fourth person is Jane Hart, who unfortunately was not able to be with us tonight, but I certainly wanted to mention her. So, gentlemen, tonight we're honoring these board members who will be leaving us at the end of this month, so the end of June is my understanding. And I just want everyone here to hear a little bit about what these gentlemen have done for us. These individuals have served in a variety of leadership positions, both at the board level and also at the committee level, and they really represent the best example of selfless dedication to their communities. Looking at all four of them, including Jan, there's a combined 16 years of service to the Department of Energy. And you all have been very instrumental in pretty much every aspect of board activities. You've participated in drafting recommendations, in helping expand the board's public outreach program, representing the board at national conferences, and of course spending hours providing leadership to the board. So there's really no way to adequately acknowledge the many contributions that these individuals have made. But I would like you all to know that your contributions have been very much appreciated, and that I think you all have been instrumental in helping to shape our path forward in the environmental management program. So for that, we're very appreciative. So I'll just mention also before we hand out plaques that I just want to recognize Chuck and David, who have both completed the maximum years that you're permitted to serve on the board, which is 6 years. No parole. So thank you very much. We do appreciate it.
Mr. Adler?
Yeah, I just had a quick logistical comment. Yeah, what happened on the July meeting is that our original plan was to have Dr. Good from USGS to come in and talk to us about the ongoing groundwater remediation strategy working group's efforts. Two things have happened that cause us to want to reschedule that. It likely will be the September presentation. One is that the sequester has impacted his travel budget, and he has a real tight limit on how many trips he can take down here. The second is that that effort has fallen just a little bit off schedule, just by a few weeks. No big problem, we'll catch up. But for those two reasons, it just makes more sense to have him come in later. Principally that he can't come because he can't get a plane ticket. That's the only comment I had tonight.
Thank you. Okay, at this time, we like to hear from our liaisons from TDEC and EPA. TDEC, you want to start us off? Dale, you going to do it?
I suppose so. I brought Andy Benford with me, and I was wanting him to do the comment, but he says he doesn't want to. I don't have any either, except I'd like to announce that we do have our annual monitoring report posted on the TDEC website now, and I'd tell you the address to it, but I can't remember it. It's so long. But if you Google up TDEC DOE Oversight, it should come up pretty close to the top. And we've got projects where we've got stream water quality projects, diversity projects and biota. We've got air monitoring, both RAD and chemical, fugitive air monitoring around the D&D sites and remediation sites. We've got some wildlife projects going on. For the past 3 years, we've been tracking white-tailed deer with GPS collars to see how far they can carry contamination. We've got a project that we're doing, actually doing in coordination with ORNL now, and that's endangered species of bats, specifically the gray in Indiana, and gathering an inventory of the bat community. And the interesting part, I'm trying to say enough to get you to look at the website and the reports, but you can record the bat calls or ultrasonic bat calls and then use a computer to identify the bats, kind of like you can identify birds by listening to their singing. So that's all I had to say. And if Andy has anything to fill in, that's fine. But, you know, go ahead and Google up our report and have fun reading it. Thanks.
Dale, I had reviewed that report before it was put on the internet, but it's up and running now. I think this is something, Spencer, I'll run the address and get it to you if you would send it out to our members. This report is, I think it's very important. First of all, I like the way it's formed. First thing they do in this report is they tell you what has changed right up front. You don't have to wander all the way through it to find out what they're not doing anymore or what they're doing. And I think this is very good. The executive summary, if you do nothing else and go through the executive summary, particularly people that are interested in long-term stewardship, you get an idea of what people are doing involved in stewardship right now, from air all the way down through groundwater. Very impressive. And then when you get into situations where we're getting down into the fine points like we do in the EM committee, the in-depth discussion, technical enough that I think that it brings a lot of value there. So please, if nothing else, get this thing out and read the executive summary. Awful good report. Did a good job on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, I guess we go to EPA.
John Richards, EPA. Once again, subbing for Connie Jones. I'm a project manager mostly over most of the Y12 and ORNL projects. I was up today for our ORNL project team meeting, and I don't really have any comments other than I will compliment the report. I go through it every year, not with a fine-tooth comb, but I really appreciate it, and I work on Savannah River and Paducah projects as well, so this doesn't go on the record, but this is by far the best state report that I look at for those 3 states. But it's very thorough and it's very helpful. So.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. I guess at this time we open up the public comment period. Ms. Hall?
The public comment period is now open. Are there any members of the public who wish to speak? As a Citizens Advisory Board to the Department of Energy on environmental cleanup, we want to encourage the community at large to attend and participate in our board and committee meetings. If you are unable to attend, please send in your questions and comments to the address shown. Appropriate comments and questions will be read during the public comment section of the Site-Specific Advisory Board meeting and will be given the same consideration by the Board and Department of Energy as those given in person. Meeting schedules and ways to communicate with the Board can be obtained by calling 241-4583 or by visiting our website.
Thank you. Okay, that closes our public comment period. Now on for the presentation for this evening. It's on the National Environmental Management Program, the big picture. David, would you please introduce someone we all know, but maybe the people that are watching or visiting here tonight may not know?
Mr. Chairman, I'll be glad to do that. It's with great honor I would like to present a person we all know, David Adler. Dave was educated at Rutgers and the University of Michigan School of Public Health, earning a Master of Science degree in environmental toxicology. He has worked for the State of Michigan Department of Natural Resources, the EPA, multiple private firms, and for the past 25 years with the Department of Energy's Environmental Management Program. During this time, he has focused primarily on activities related to contamination site cleanup, waste management and disposition, and stakeholder involvement. Dave is no stranger to Oak Ridge, and from what I've heard, he kind of grew up around here, understands the streams and byways and the wildlife, flora, and fauna. So they couldn't get a better presenter for this topic.
Well, let's see if you can make the clicker work. Thank you. Actually, before I jump into this, I forgot to mention or to reiterate, while the July meeting of the full board is canceled, as we mentioned, there will be the training session for new members. Doesn't last too long, pretty painless. It's just an opportunity for new members to come in, understand a little bit about the board's historical focus, how our subcommittee structure works, and probably allows new members to hit the ground running a little bit more effectively for the board retreat. So open to everybody, but it's really focused on the new members, some of whom I see took the time out to come tonight, so thank you for that. It's a little bit of a continuation on the field trip we took in the van a couple weeks ago. Thank you for that, too. Okay, can we dim these lights so that that comes out a little bit better? You can sleep better. I'll stand over here so people can focus on the screen. Please don't be intimidated by the number of slides. I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. And in fact, I encourage you to focus actually on the screen, because logistically you'll see that'll work better rather than try to follow along in your packets. A month or so ago, it was suggested that it would be useful to the board to get a bit of the big picture on the environmental management program nationally. A lot of people have a pretty good handle on what's happening in Oak Ridge now, but in order to serve as a board member, it was suggested it might be helpful for people to understand how the EM program works nationally. So I'm going to spend just about 15 minutes tonight giving a sense of the big picture. That's the big building that pays for the big picture. That's the Forrestal building, block away from the mall, right behind the Smithsonian Institution. That's where our bosses exist, and basically that's where the EM, Environmental Management Program, is based. As you all know, the EM program nationally fundamentally was set up in the late 80s to deal with the cleanup associated with four to 5 decades worth of activity associated with first the Manhattan Project, then the Cold War, and all the associated nuclear energy development activity associated with that. So we did about 5 decades worth of learning and industrial production. In the late 80s, we jumped into the business of cleaning up after all that, and there really wasn't much focus on that prior to that. A slide that gives a general sense. Oh, by the way, I set this up so that it would be useful as a reference to people later on, so there are a few more slides than I will cover. I tried to be a little bit more detailed in the slides. I've actually pulled the slides from presentations made by the head of the EM organization, Dave Huizinga. Much of it is what he has used to help promote and advocate the agency's budget for FY14. In the big picture, what we do in the cleanup program is clean up, as I mentioned, after the Cold War, the Manhattan Project, and a lot of energy, particularly nuclear energy development activities that have been sponsored by the Department of Energy for quite some time. The subcomponents of that work boil down to 3 or 4 big areas. One is tearing down a lot of old buildings that we have no use for. You'll hear that referred to as D&D, and Oak Ridge is one of the biggest D&D projects in the complex. Another big thrust is dealing with basically spent nuclear fuels and materials from weapons production. That involves dealing with a lot of what's commonly referred to as special nuclear materials, things that we don't want the wrong people to get a hold of and that need to be put into a secure status to keep us all safe. There's also a fair amount of waste that has been put into various places where it needs to be retrieved, primarily a material called transuranic waste. And that's a national program that I'll give you a little bit more information on. And then when you hear about the EM program, you often hear about something called tank waste. Sometimes it's referred to as liquid waste. But basically, whenever you're in the business of reprocessing spent nuclear fuels or producing plutonium, you have a lot of leftovers. And those leftovers end up in tanks. We have a few sites with tanks. Those tanks contain liquid waste, and that's a huge, huge component of the DOE cleanup program. All right. I mentioned, about 5 decades worth of activity, largely conducted in an unregulated environment. A lot of it conducted in a war mentality production type mindset. Of course, the Manhattan Project was a big, big push. The Cold War, again, a big, big push. DOE for decades operated outside of any environmental regulation. So you take the use of very hazardous materials, put them into secret kind of war mentality production activities, excuse any regulatory oversight, and you can end up with a pretty good environmental program. That was the basis for the EM program. After that kind of discouraging statement, I want to start with a positive note. If you look at the slide on the top, on the left, every blue dot across North America is a former cleanup obligation on the part of the Department of Energy. Some of them were the big sites like Oak Ridge and Savannah and Hanford, and others were less significant sites, no trivial challenges, but less significant sites. Some of those were private contractor facilities that supported the big sites. But as you can see, already in the couple of decades that we've been working the EM program now, we've reduced from the number of blue dots on the left-hand side to the number on the right-hand side. So we're making real progress. Naturally, the ones that are left are the big, tough ones, and the ones that we'll be working on for decades to come. What I'd like to do tonight is to give a little bit of an overview on the biggest of the big sites, and also some kind of drill down a little bit on some of the cleanup programs specific to those sites. Okay, here's the big budget picture. Terry Tyborowski from our budget office prepared this slide, and it's kind of neat because really when you look at government programs, priorities are reflective of budgets. And if you look at how this big dollar bill, which is actually about a $5.6 billion per annum budget for the EM cleanup program, you can get a sense of how we allocate our resources. The tank waste that I mentioned earlier, the leftovers from plutonium production generally, are our biggest single budget item. And we have those activities taking place at Hanford, Idaho, and the Savannah River site. Facility D&D, just taking down these massive industrial structures, many of which are no longer in use. Some of them are reactors, some of them are isotope production facilities, but all of them have no continuing use in the department's mission, and tearing them down is a big component of what we do. Oak Ridge is, of course, a big component of that. In decreasing budget order comes the spent nuclear fuel activity, then transuranic waste, soil and groundwater cleanup, which is very important, but it's not nearly as expensive or as massive of an effort as the other things. And then finally, what we call essential site services. This is just the money that we spend to make sure that we can operate in a compliant manner, running our wastewater treatment plants and our landfills and things of that sort. So Oak Ridge doesn't really play in the radioactive tank waste realm. As a point of historical fact, Oak Ridge is where they developed those separation technologies. We had some tanks that were 100,000 gallon tanks, which sounds big, but it's small compared to the million gallon tanks out at Hanford. Our tanks have already been evacuated, so we're kind of out of the tank waste business. So we don't get much of that money. We do spend a lot of money in the D&D front. the U-233 project at Ornell is an example of our place in the spent nuclear fuels realm. We do play or participate in transuranic waste activities, and of course we have a lot of soil and groundwater cleanup taking place. It's another slide slicing the pie a different way that just allows you to get a sense of how much money goes to the different states. Richland and river protection are two components of the Hanford site. So as you can see, maybe 30–40% of all of EM's budget goes out to Washington State. Savannah River is another very large site. After those two are taken away, we're about the biggest site right now. And then there are a large number of much smaller sites in terms of budget. Now, understand that Oak Ridge in the DOE complex is a big deal. We're a big part of the cleanup program. We're a huge part of the weapons mission and the science mission. This slide doesn't speak to the amount of money Oak Ridge receives for the lab and for Y-12. Okay, I'll spend just a few minutes talking about each of the big sites. This is where I'll use my cheat sheet a little bit. Okay, the Hanford site is located out in southeastern, up in the steppe desert of southeastern Washington. It was developed as the nation's, one of the two locations where the nation produces plutonium for weapons development. It actually, as I mentioned earlier, if you take the graphite reactor in the 3019 building, where we first learned how to irradiate uranium and produce plutonium, and then do chemical extractions from that fuel and extract the plutonium, process developed in Oak Ridge, exported to Hanford, Washington, and scaled up a millionfold. That's the Hanford site. So the Hanford site has a large production facility involving a fairly significant number of reactors. You've probably heard of the Hanford B reactor, which was the reactor used during the Manhattan Project itself. Further back, away from the river, are a lot of tank farms that contain tank waste. Luckily, it doesn't rain much out there, so there's not a big push of contamination from where it sits down into the groundwater, but there's a lot of radioactivity, a very large quantity of very high activity waste that justifies much of the budget they spend out there. That site is developing a treatment system for all their tank waste. That's their principal mission. Hanford really does not have a production mission anymore. We're not in the business of producing plutonium anymore. So aside from a small science laboratory that exists out there, it's basically a cleanup mission. Someday it will clean itself up and Hanford will not really exist as a big DOE site anymore. It's owned by the Environmental Management Program, unlike Oak Ridge, which is owned by a collection of missions. And as I mentioned earlier, I set this up so that you could refer back to it later. Basically, after each big picture, you'll have a couple of bullets that speak to what I just said. So that's what I just said. Click. Idaho's an interesting site, located not far from Idaho Falls, about 30 miles out in the desert, excuse me, from Idaho Falls. It was a site that was developed principally to develop and test nuclear reactor technology. It's a perfect site for doing that because the location of the DOE facility itself is way out in the middle of nowhere. Most of the community that works at that site lives in Idaho Falls. A good portion of them get on a bus and go for about an hour-long car ride or bus ride to get to work. Once they get out to the Idaho, I guess it's now called INEL, Idaho National Engineering Lab, you come upon all the test facilities, and this is actually a location where they developed reactors and would run them essentially to failure. They're looking at how reactors would perform under extreme conditions. They would intentionally push reactors to the limit and see how they behaved. As you can imagine, sometimes they behave poorly or they fail and leave you with a little bit of a cleanup problem. They also did at Idaho, they also did a fair amount of spent fuel reprocessing. They developed methods for spent fuel reprocessing, which basically involves taking spent fuel and subjecting it to chemical extractions. So again, you produce a lot of liquid waste. A lot of that liquid waste is transuranic waste. So most of the cleanup activity out there is associated with decommissioning the old facilities that they've created and no longer use, and dealing with the waste streams that were produced during those active activities. There still are engineering research missions at the INL site, so it has a continuing mission in addition to being cleaned up. Los Alamos is one of the 3 sites that were part of the Manhattan Project. It's located up on a mesa it's about 30, 40 miles northwest of Santa Fe. And this is where kind of the more glamorous component work of the Manhattan Project took place. Oak Ridge was the big factory that produced the fuels for the weapons. Los Alamos is where a lot of the scientists that were actually involved in the design and assembly and then testing of the nuclear bomb took place. So all the movies that you see about the Manhattan Project tend to spend a lot of time focusing on the Los Alamos site. That's where Oppenheimer and that whole crowd did their thing. They have a continuing mission. It remains a big defense laboratory, but because of the activities that took place out there during their nuclear weapons and power development activities, they also have a fairly significant cleanup mission also. A lot of the work that they did took place in canyons around the plant. Like Oak Ridge, Los Alamos, the facility is sort of integrated with the community. It's the only other site I've visited where you can be in a residential neighborhood and actually have essentially an eye shot to DOE facilities. Their cleanup budget isn't that big, their cleanup challenge isn't that big, but it is a significant, relatively significant part of the cleanup mission for Oak Ridge, for the DOE national program. These mountains up here, if you go out there now, it's kind of discouraging. All the forests have been burnt off because of the terrible wildfires they've had. Okay, so that's what I said. The Nevada National Security Site, located north of Las Vegas, is the site where most of the weapons testing that DOE has conducted over the decades has taken place. The numbers are listed there, but there were 100 atmospheric tests where devices were set up above ground, and then an enormous number of underground tests that took place at the Nevada test site. I've been out here a few times. I believe several of you have been out there also. You ride on a bus and you see huge craters in the ground from where they set off weapons underground, and things were glassified and consolidated and dropped down and leave a big crater. It still has some continuing role in the defense arena. It also is a site where DOE sends a lot of its waste. It's, again, a pretty good place for the more dangerous waste streams, some of the more dangerous waste streams that DOE generates from its production missions and its cleanup mission. They only have surface disposal facilities. They have no deep geologic repositories, but they do have surface disposal facilities. So when Oak Ridge cleans up a building and it generates some material that's too hazardous for us to dispose of locally, but it's not transuranic waste, it has to be stuck 1,000 feet underground in a geologic repository, a lot of it ends up at the Nevada test site, formerly known as the Nevada test site. Now it's called NNSS. This one should be familiar to everybody. Oak Ridge is probably the most complicated DOE site in the DOE complex because of its multiple missions. The Manhattan Project to begin with, all of the money essentially spent on the Manhattan Project was managed through Oak Ridge. About half of the money associated with the Manhattan Project never left Oak Ridge because Oak Ridge played such a significant role. We had the less glamorous but heavy lift work. We were the big uranium refinery. We were the place where uranium was brought and enriched for the purpose of producing fuels for the first couple of bombs and then for a lot of work after that. So we have 3 principal sites now. One is the former gaseous diffusion plant, K-25, which you're all familiar with, and that operated for decades and was in the business of gaseous diffusion and purifying U-235 first for weapons and then for power industry. We have our second site, the Oak Ridge National Lab, also the nation's most diverse government laboratory, and of course the Y-12 plant, which has a big defense mission. We have two sister sites in the gaseous diffusion business. In the 52-54 time frame, Washington decided that the U.S. did not have sufficient capacity to produce enriched uranium, and they decided that we needed to treble our ability to produce enriched uranium. So 2 more sites were built to augment the capabilities in Oak Ridge. One was the Paducah site, which I believe was built in 52. Second was the Portsmouth site, I believe opened up in 54. And their sole focus was taking uranium, which would have been converted to uranium hexafluoride, running it through this gaseous diffusion process, enriching uranium, both, again, for power and for weapons purposes, and in some cases to run naval subs and so forth. Both of these sites are closed or closing and do not really have a big role in the DOE complex anymore, other than to get themselves cleaned up, which will be a very expensive D&D job, very, very similar to what we're doing out at the K-25 site. They also have become the place where all the leftovers from Oak Ridge's gaseous diffusion activities were sent. It's been years now since these big canisters of processed uranium hexafluoride existed at Oak Ridge. There were thousands of them, I believe 6,000 or 7,000. They've all been shipped up to Paducah and Portsmouth to be converted to a more stable form for disposal. So we owe some thanks to our northern friends for taking that waste, and over time they will be spending enormous amounts of money making those sites go away. Their future mission or their objectives are very similar to our objectives at the K-25 site. That is to clean up the site, remove the surface facilities, and hand the sites over for redevelopment as new industrial parks for economic development activity. It's just a shot of the Paducah site. It looks an awful lot like the K-25 site and the Oak Ridge site. And the last site, I believe, no, there's one more thing I'll talk about, but the last big site I'm going to mention is the Savannah River site. Savannah River site is located down outside of Aiken, South Carolina. It's a huge reservation. It's even larger than the Oak Ridge Reservation by quite a bit. And it was used to complement the Hanford site for plutonium production. It also was used for tritium production. Both of those are commodities in the weapons endeavor. It has some continuing missions. Excuse me just a second, let me get to that. Because there are some unique facilities that I'll talk about in a moment at the Savannah site that make it uniquely positioned to assist in dispositioning excess plutonium. We now have more plutonium than we need or want to place into weapon systems, but the plutonium has some value as a potential use for powering power plants. So one of the things that's happening in Savannah is the development of something called a MOX plant, M-O-X, it stands for mixed oxide fuel. And it's basically a process where they can take weapons-grade plutonium, convert it into nuclear fuel, burn up, in effect, ultimately the plutonium so it's not available. So that supports our non-proliferation objectives, and it also takes care of the plutonium issue. So at Savannah River, they have problems, they have challenges. They don't have problems, it's challenges. Much like exist out at Hanford. Large quantities of leftovers from plutonium production, large quantities of liquid waste. To their credit, they've actually already come up with and are operating a system for dispositioning the liquid waste and converting it into glass rods for disposal. Okay, let's talk just a little bit about some of the huge facilities we've built and programs we've established to achieve our 4 principal missions. Number 1, the Radioactive Liquid Waste Challenge. I just mentioned that at Hanford they've built this facility called the DWPF, Defense Waste Processing Facility. It's an enormous concrete structure, extremely well shielded, the largest facility of its type in the world, set up to convert a lot of this liquid waste into a solid glass. And that glass form is good for nothing other than disposal. And someday when the nation elects to site and construct sufficient underground disposal, actually geologic disposal capacity, those glass logs will be sent there. The original plan was that glass vitrified waste from this plant would be sent to the Yucca Mountain site. I think you all know the story with Yucca Mountain. It's on hold at best. So they're still stabilizing the waste, putting it into storage, and seeking a disposal alternative for that waste. Idaho is also in the business of building their analog, basically. They call it the IWTU, the Integrated Waste Treatment Unit. It should start operating fairly shortly, and it too will process Idaho's liquid tank waste facilities. These are all multi-billion-dollar facilities, to give you a sense of how big they are. Fortunately, we Oak Ridge are not reliant on those facilities because we don't have the type of waste that requires that type of facility for processing. But those are big, big construction projects. The one on top is done and operating. I believe the one below is supposed to get going before too long. And then at Hanford, they are also building an even larger, the largest processing facility for tank waste. That project, which I don't even know what the estimated price tag is for it now, it's billions and billions of dollars. I can get the number for you, but it's a lot more than we ever expected it to be. It's taking a lot longer to build it than we ever expected to build it. It is the biggest push in the Department of Energy right now. And hopefully we will get it done because the cost of maintaining the waste in the tanks is so high. This is one of those projects that if we can get it done, we can relieve the department of a huge carrying cost and have money available then to complete the balance of the cleanup missions in Oak Ridge. But that's what you can see so far. Over on the left-hand side is the part that's still under construction. It seems to be undergoing a lot of design reviews and so forth. But Hanford is the biggest project in the Department of Energy, and it's still got a ways to go. Okay. The other big thing we do that I mentioned is facility decommissioning, tearing down old buildings and throwing them away. And Oak Ridge has the biggest of the active decommissioning projects in the entire complex. And you're all familiar with the K-25 building. Up on the top of the slide is the way it looked not too many years ago. Lower end of the slide is actually not quite what it looks like now, because this component of the building, it's the big U, remember, about a mile around, about 45 acres. We did this wing first, the west wing went next. After a lot of evaluation on the possibility of preserving what's called the north tower of the north wing, we concluded we could not, and we've now dismantled it and disposed of it. All that's left is a little bit of one wing of the building that has some unique contamination challenges. We're actually just about to get approval for the disposition plan for that, and we'll be tearing it down also. So before long, the K-25 building will be gone, but it was really the biggest D&D project in the world, and it's going to be done pretty soon. And it's fairly typical of the D&D, decontamination and decommissioning projects, that DOE takes on. Not real high tech. You basically have to deal with the safety issues to make the building safe to take down, and then you dismantle it with large, what they call heavy iron, huge pieces of construction equipment that dismantle the building, load it into trucks, and all the material from D&D projects, for the most part, goes to disposal. This is surface disposal. About 90% of the volume of waste from D&D projects is typically disposed of at the site that originates it. So in the case of Oak Ridge, the D&D waste is taken to the Environmental Management Waste Management Facility. About 10% of it is challenges our waste disposal capabilities in Oak Ridge, so it gets sent out west. A lot of it to the Nevada test site. Okay, and this is just another slide that brings back the next big D&D projects to go are our sister plants up in Paducah and Portsmouth. This is a lot of these buildings look the same. I apologize for that, but this is something that you'll hear referred to sometimes as the H Canyon at the Savannah River site. It's the unique facility I mentioned before. It's a huge concrete tank. And within that concrete tank, that's extremely well shielded, very, very thick concrete walls, you can throw spent nuclear fuels, all types of highly hazardous, very radioactive material, and subject them to chemical extractions or chemical processing methods. So it's the only facility we have of that type in the complex, and it plays a big role in dealing with some of our spent nuclear fuels. So I just threw a slide up there because you'll hear about the H Canyon. A lot of times when people have a challenging waste and they don't know what to do with it, the answer seems to be take it down to the H Canyon, dissolve it in acid, and dispose of the material. Okay. Nuclear materials. There was a lot of plutonium at a few different locations, and Oak Ridge actually has a pretty big chunk of the spent or the Special Nuclear Materials Enterprise in DOE. It's the U-233, or Building 3019 building you just got a presentation on not too long ago. This is very challenging work. It's very expensive. The dollars per mass of material managed are very, very high, but it's very important work because in each case, Oak Ridge has its case and other sites have theirs, you're often dealing with material that actually could be used to make weapons. And it's excess to our weapons needs. So basically we are in the business of making it go away. In this case, our special nuclear material that nobody wants is co-located with the Oak Ridge National Lab, which the world wants. The world wants to send its scientists to Oak Ridge to do its research. So it's a huge priority for us, and the same story exists at a few other sites in the complex, to make those special nuclear materials go away. Okay, let's talk just a little bit about the transuranic waste challenge. Transuranic waste is waste that has a very, very long half-life and tends to be fairly mobile in the environment, so it requires special disposal methods. Transuranic waste is not, actually by law, is required to be managed in a geologic repository. So we've built a facility out in southern New Mexico called the WIP, Waste Isolation Pilot Project, at New Mexico, where they basically have tunneled down, I believe, in excess of 1,000 feet into salt formations, carved cavities into the salt formations, and use that to isolate this material that lasts a long time and is particularly hazardous. The concept, and it works, is that you place the material in this extremely stable and dry setting. Over time, the salt, which is actually behaves as a liquid, it just moves very slowly, re-encases the waste, and it's permanently locked up in that disposal facility. So that facility is very important to the DOE cleanup program because it's the only geologic repository we have right now. And a lot of sites send their waste to it. In fact, I believe the next site shows that we, Savannah, and Idaho are all dependent upon that facility for our success. There's talk of having some additional waste sent to that facility. So we all kind of owe some thanks to Carlsbad. I can remember 15 years ago when I'd put a drawing up showing how waste went from one facility to the other. There tended to be arrows going west and some arrows going east. In other words, there was more equity on the marketing and exchange of waste. Right now, I think the east is winning and the west is kind of losing. We, Oak Ridge, used to have an arrow that came to us because we had this big incinerator that was the only incinerator of its type that could take certain types of radiologically and PCB contaminated oils from Paducah and Portsmouth and elsewhere across the complex. So we were kind of doing our share to support the Oak Ridge cleanup, the National Cleanup Program. I still think we are, but we aren't taking much waste from anywhere else. There are some commercial facilities in town, but those are just commercial facilities like commercial facilities in any other state. So it's just, I think, something to keep in the back of our mind that where we can safely dispose of our waste locally, it's probably in our interstate equity, good neighbor interest to do so. We will always be dependent on the western states for disposal of some of our waste streams. Okay, and the TRU is just an example of that. And just a couple more slides. Because the cleanup program, the National Cleanup Program, is focusing on facilities that were built for a very specific purpose. They're usually one-of-a-kind facilities that don't exist anywhere else. Facilities that were built not with their ultimate shutting down and cleanup in mind, and facilities that were built with some pretty uniquely hazardous materials. We have some pretty challenging, some pretty large technological challenges associated with cleaning them up, particularly the super high hazard facilities out west. So it is our hope that by investing some amount of money in technology development, we might find some clever techniques for reducing the cost, the projected enormous cost of completing the cleanup mission across the nation. Now in Oak Ridge, we have some high-tech challenging things, but a lot of our work is more low-tech, tearing down buildings, packaging waste, closing old landfills. So our technology development needs may not be as profound as some other sites, though we do have some. Anything we can do to better characterize and identify where mercury is going to be helpful for us in cleaning up Oak Ridge, as an example. We do have very complicated groundwater challenges in Oak Ridge, so technology development in the area of groundwater contamination characterization or modeling is in our interest. We aren't in the business of loading glass, and we really don't do much separation, so those two components aren't important to us. But I just wanted to mention that there is a national technology development program that's part of EM. Some of the work is done at the national labs, but about, up there it says our request is 2014, I believe we target about 2% of our site budgets for technology development. Okay, and then the last slide before questions. In the big picture, this massive cleanup program faces huge financial challenges. The national government is wrestling with a very difficult fiscal situation, and EM is challenged by that just like any other program. So getting the job done will require a lot of creativity and the identification of intelligent, cost-effective cleanup approaches. And that's something we're going to be continuously pressed to pursue. Every year we're going to be asked how we can get the work done at lower cost without as much reliance on very generous budgets. I can remember, just to give you some perspective, when I first got in the cleanup business, DOE making a request of Congress for, say, $6 billion to clean up across the nation. And Congress said, you need more money than that, have $7 billion. There literally was a year or two where the requests we made were met with offers that were greater than the requests we made. That's not the situation anymore. Our budgets have gone down from the 7-8 range about 15 years ago to the $5 billion range, and it's a struggle to keep them there. So that's going to be a big part of our challenge, and we hope to get there by working with our regulatory agencies to identify cost-effective remedies, working with stakeholders to make sure that we have a world-class project management organization so that we don't find ourselves with cost overruns, project hiccups that stretch schedules out. And hopefully, over the next 30 to 40 years, we'll get it done. So that's a snapshot of the national program. I'm not expert in all the other sites, but I'll do my best to try and answer some questions if people have any. Yes, Jimmy.
Dave, that was great.
Thanks.
And I really appreciate your putting this thing all together, and I intend to use this as some references
Okay.
in my future. Is there a book that puts all of this together? And if not, why don't you and I write it?
I'm sure there are materials produced by headquarters that lay out the big picture and what we have left to do. Sue, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, actually, you can find a pretty good synopsis of the entire program in the budget volumes that have been released with the President's budget. So we can provide a link, gives a synopsis of the sites and the challenges and what their funding profiles are and projects and whatnot. That sort of gives a nice summary across the complex. That's the closest thing I can think of.
The other thing I'd say is, you didn't include some important points that I would have included had I been making the presentation.
Okay.
May I go into one of
Of course you can.
I would have talked quite a bit about the plutonium production at Hanford with respect to the graphite reactors, graphite moderated reactors, letting people know that that is a very similar type of reactor as to what was a big problem in Russia when that reactor went down, and that was a graphite moderated reactor that was indeed for weapons as well as power production. And that those graphite reactors are not at all used in this country anymore
Right.
for any purpose. I would have mentioned that Idaho really doesn't have a tank waste program. They have a solids waste program. The reason for that is because Idaho, when they process, and I would have said that Idaho was put there really, and Argonne West is the one that was testing reactors and so forth at Idaho. But Idaho processed spent fuel, as you said, but it was naval fuel. It's highly enriched naval fuel. And what they did was pretty brilliant with respect to tank waste, is because they calcined all of that waste rather than put it into the liquid form. And that calcined waste still sits in those big canisters out there for many years, and those canisters are getting older than they were ever intended to be there. And so their vitrification program would be not starting from tank waste, but starting with that calcined waste business. I think that's a real difference and a real compliment to whoever came up with not generating the liquid waste, because the liquid waste at Hanford is one of our biggest, if not the biggest, problem in EM. The National Security Site, which is where the disposal facility was to be and may still come back. It's not totally dead,
Right.
as I understand it. It's there's a political reason for that it's in limbo right now. And then, if you look at Savannah River, where they indeed had tank waste similar to what Hanford had, but not nearly so much of it, and they put in a vitrification system a long time ago, 20 years ago, I guess. And they have actually vitrified a lot of their high-level waste, but they don't have anything anywhere to put it. It's glass that's just continuously stored there. If there's ever a repository built, that would certainly be where it goes. Same thing goes for the West New York facility.
Right.
Help me with the name of that.
West
Valley.
West Valley, yeah,
Right.
where indeed that was a commercial processing facility, and it's owned really by the state and DOE jointly together, and so that increases the difficulty in making decisions. But they put in a vitrification plant also, and they generate a vitrified waste, which is also stored there on that site. I think it's a terrible ordeal for us to produce this waste and then not have anything to do with it.
Right.
The Oak Ridge Reservation holds an important place in our nation's history, and it continues to play a vital role in national defense and modern scientific and computational research. But decades of work on the reservation dating back to World War II have left some parts of the reservation contaminated with radioactive or other hazardous waste. It's the job of the U.S. Department of Energy to clean up those residual hazards. DOE relies on citizen input on those cleanup operations. The Oak Ridge Site-Specific Advisory Board is the primary source of advice and recommendations to DOE on its environmental management program. The board offers advice on a wide range of activities, from safe, secure disposal of radioactive waste to long-term stewardship of areas with waste left in place. Be part of this important work by attending the monthly meetings of the Oak Ridge Site-Specific Advisory Board. Call us for more information or visit our website.